Hi, my name is Frank Vogt. You're listening to the Hunting for Healers podcast, episode 16. Today I talked to author Kris Newby. She wrote the book called BITTEN. It's about Lyme disease history, the political landscape, and the history of biowarfare in the United States and its association with Lyme disease as we know it now. Multiple co-infections existing in one tick, ticks that are prolific at multiplying, ticks that are difficult to detect, diseases that are difficult to detect, and resistant to antibiotics. Now, I had heard this before, but the way Kris builds this case, it's very believable to think the United States government has some responsibility here with Lyme disease, and that there is perhaps a cover-up going on. Kris doesn't exaggerate. She lays out the research, and she makes the case that we need to look deeper into this issue, especially with everything going on in COVID and trying to understand where it came from. She makes the association between the United States bioweapons program and the Cold War, competing against the Russians, built with Nazi scientists. She's well-researched, very clear, and is a wonderful woman to talk to. So I'm so happy to interview Kris Newby, author of the book Bitten. Let's get your seatbelts on. This one, get your popcorn ready.
Oh my God, I cannot breathe. Hello, you're free.
I believe that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is Iboga.
Shamanic practice is to actually go visit yourself at your own death.
Withdraw your permission. Tell it to get the hell out of here.
They use crushed seashells, coca leaves, and saliva.
Then I land back on Earth. Everybody thinks it's just been 3 years, but it's been maybe 3 lifetimes for me.
The Hunting for Healers podcast.
Hi, Frank. How are you?
Well, I'm so happy you're taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks for the invite. I love the look and feel of your website.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I mean, there's so much to talk about. It's so important. You know, I'm not in particular a very conspiratorial type of person. I just think it's sticky. Like you walk into something, it's hard to know what's real and what's not. And I had heard about the possible association with Lyme or tick-borne diseases with Plum Island and with possible biowarfare. And then I read your book and really felt like you had made the bridge from conspiracy to journalism with Lyme or tick-borne disease infections. And that, you know, sometimes bad stories are true. Sometimes there are dark histories behind things that we can point to and say, yeah, this is happening. What made you feel like this was your story to tell?
Well, I think the fact that my husband and I both got Lyme disease, I never would have chosen this path. Now that I look back at my life before, it feels a little bit self-centered and I would say I was a tough chick. You know, I did marathon running all through college and went into engineering, which was a really tough profession to go into if you're a cute blonde. And so I went into a male dominated world. And yeah, so I think having a disease bring you down like this was humbling. And it's been a process of learning compassion and then thinking about having a goal-driven life, and perfectionism was sort of damaging. And so this was a hard reset, and it's been sort of really interesting. And then learning how great it feels to share what I've learned about the disease and the world, which, you know, our view of our country and the world is a little idealized. And so I lifted up the lid of the Pandora's box and I had dared to look in.
Yeah, you sure did. What do you mean by perfectionism when you're talking about your development to this point?
Yeah, I was a classic overachiever, I would say, just pushing myself to the limit and wanting everything to be perfect and thinking that would make me happy, I guess. And going through this whole disease process and it was humbling. And you just realize it's not really important how much you get done in a day, but what you get done and is it relevant, and just the satisfaction of giving back to others. Forgiving, yeah, actually, all the people that misdiagnosed me along the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, your story, and we'll get into it for sure about your journey through Lyme. Your book is really also a story in a way of Willy Burgdorfer. I looked him up for the first time before the interview on Wikipedia, and it's a very different story than the story you get to tell. And not just, may I say, a story that you're telling on your own, but a story that's been informed by what he's told you. And so the experience that even he was admitting to, he was revealing before his passing, is very different than the one. So this is the person who is credited with finding the spirochete that is credited with causing Lyme disease. And for sure, he was part of that research, but he in a way also created the very conditions in the first place. Is that true?
Yeah, and that truly, Willy Burgdorfer's life is what made this story really interesting, because I had rare access to his lab books, his phone logs, his personal letters, because before he died, he gave it to a professor in Utah to archive in BYU. So I thought it was going to be a straight sort of journalistic reveal. Oh, the Lyme outbreak involved several biological weapons, but instead it was about Willy Burgdorfer's life, about how he was a really idealistic. He came from lower classes in the lower economic classes in Switzerland, and he was ambitious, and he got a PhD in basically medical zoology, parasitology, and then had a chance to come to America, work in a lab, have lab assistants, be a great scientist. But almost immediately when he arrived here, he went into the bowels of the U.S. biological weapons program. Specifically, he was a consultant trying to mix and match insects and bugs with germs. He would stuff them with them so they could be dropped on the enemies. So you look at Wikipedia and it was, Willy Burgdorfer, 36 years working for National Institutes of Health, looking for cures for dangerous microbes. So the reveal I had was, well, that is not quite the whole story. This is what I call the secret history of Lyme disease, is that Willy Burgdorfer for almost 2 decades worked in the biological weapons program on bugs of mass destruction.
Yeah. And before we get into your story again, would you say, on top of this all, giving like a wide view of it, how convinced are you that the current state of affairs with tick-borne diseases is directly related to, we can say, U.S. government, maybe other governments as well, actually creating the conditions themselves?
It's not a slam dunk. I was telling my husband the other day, it was like I hit a double. I didn't hit a home run. I didn't find the absolute smoking gun. But I think there's enough circumstantial evidence that it gives epidemiologists, the people who trace the spread of disease, it gives researchers figuring out what pathogens are epidemic in certain areas. It gives them some leads to start pursuing. And it also takes us out of the scientists out of this little box where, this huge outbreak of diseases, which really reared its ugly head in the 70s around the New York metropolitan area, including Lyme, Connecticut. It's like, well, maybe it isn't natural that 3 freaky new tick-borne diseases, a few that had never been in man before, just showed up and out of the blue made people really sick. I mean, you're thinking about COVID, same thing. We had flu viruses every year, but all of a sudden 3 new germs. And so the book, I hope, will spark people to look deeper instead of just the story that, it's global warming and we're living in deer habitat. I think it's just more complicated than that. So back to your question, what do I think? I think I would I'll put probabilities on it. Things we definitely know is that an Army-funded project released hundreds of thousands of non-native ticks on the Atlantic bird flyway zone, and they made them radioactive for the purpose of seeing how they would spread over months to years if we drop them on the enemies. So radioactive ticks, hitching rides up the Atlantic coast to that area. I think that's like a 90% chance that 90% chance that sparked all of a sudden a huge epidemic of Rocky Mountain spotted fever on Long Island, which continues to spread because those ticks were the kind that spread Rocky Mountain spotted fever, not deer ticks. Then I think so. Another big find is that we dropped infected ticks on Cuba. And I talked to the guy who dumped boxes of ticks in 1962. And Cuba's 50 miles as the bird flies to Florida. There were some freaky new diseases that broke out in Florida. So I think that some of those diseases could have spread to Florida. And I do know that they have a huge Rocky Mountain spotted fever problem now in Florida. Then the other part, which is sort of the big reveal of Willy Burgdorfer, is, his claim to fame was he discovered Lyme disease in 1981. It's when he published around Lyme, Connecticut and Shelter Island, New York. And the discovery was the spirochete. What he told me, and it was confirmed in his lab notebooks and the archives, was that there was at least one other organism that he was told to sweep under the rug. And he told another documentarian person, he believes that was the biological weapon, one of the biological weapons that the program worked on, the 50s, 60s. And he discovered it and was told to blame all the illness on the Lyme spirochete. So it's sort of a complicated story, but think of the spirochete as an innocent bystander in ticks, or at least they thought it was an innocent bystander. And somehow there was an escape or release of multiple tick-borne pathogens, and the combination of the spirochete and a weaponized thing, which he thought was a rickettsia, which is a very, very small bacterium that hides out inside cells. So it's hard to detect it. So that is, I think, what the big story is. But everything I see points to a huge cover-up around that rickettsia, which I labeled Swiss Agent USA because it was also in Europe. So that's sort of the complicated story, which is why it had to be a whole book. I wish it was simpler.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at the complexity of Lyme disease, and you make a good case in your book for each of these complexities that they were man-influenced or human-influenced. Number one is that co-infections, there are usually multiple co-infections, at least with people who get more sick. Number two is that their resistance, at least to some degree, to antibiotics. Number three is that these tick-borne diseases, that they're difficult to detect, difficult to test for. And then we have the radioactive components. So all of these things were actually, we know for a fact that all these things were going on, right? These are things that we all had an intention of creating as a bioweapon.
Yeah, and to make it more understandable why people did it and how many open air uncontrolled experiments there were in this, from pretty much 51 through 72 is I go through some of the open air vulnerability tests, and this is the biological weapons program. And basically they said they admit to about 235 open air tests, but I suspect there are more. But vulnerability tests they were competing for military dollars from the nuclear weapons program. So they wanted to prove to the Pentagon and Congress how vulnerable we were to biological weapons attacks. So they filled a live bacteria, which they thought was harmless, and now we know it isn't, in a light bulb, smashed it down a grate from the sidewalk level of the New York City subway system. Then had undercover people with sniffers and briefcases and camera cases all around the New York subway to see how far it would spread when the subway rushed by and the vacuum sucked it in. And they did this official report that said this live bacteria that we released, which is very close to anthrax in size, would have killed X hundreds of thousands of people in New York if the enemies had done it. And, we are our worst enemy. They did that in the Pennsylvania subways, on boats off San Francisco Bay, in places in Florida, and so on and so forth. So they, in the interest of biodefense, they put their own people at risk.
Yeah, and what's interesting is in a lot of these, like you mentioned what happened with the droppings in Cuba, which was done to destabilize the economy, to kind of revenge on Castro for Bay of Pigs by Kennedy. What was interesting is it didn't get very far to immediately have side effects or drawback. I mean, the pilot, you explained that the pilot who dropped this, that he came back and his son got what was thought of as an extreme tropical fever. His fever spiked 105, had to get a tracheotomy to even survive, and thankfully he did. But it's just my understanding that you might be connecting his work with the dropping the ticks and possible infection with his family.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I interviewed him several times, and that's what he said. He said, I think whatever I brought home to my infant son was on my clothes when I came back from Cuba. He did some ground operations and the tick dropping. And when he talked to his superior and said, hey, my son's really sick, and he says, take your clothes and burn them. So both his boss and he thought that this operation in Cuba was, there was some sort of organism on the clothes that
Possibly more than just a tick.
I don't know. I grilled him. He said there was no other insects he used personally.
So it would have to have been a tick that got attached to his clothes, and then
Yeah. Just think about it. He was flying in Air America, CIA cover jets, and you're flying low over the sugarcane fields. You open up the hatch. There's blowback, of course, and he's opening up. He said cardboard boxes, dumping the ticks out, and of course there would be some blowback, literal blowback. And the same thing happened with the U.S. also had plans to put plague and fleas to drop on the enemy, and
plague,
then
like the Black Plague,
like the bubonic plague that has almost wiped out the human race several times.
Let's mess around with that.
Yeah. And so they did open air test in Dugway, Utah, pretty close to where I am now. And they did them with uninfected ticks, and in the desert floor, they carved little circles and then put guinea pig cages all around. And then they had a jet fly over, and they released these, I think it's M55 bombs, and they had little tubes in them, and they released the little tubes in a certain altitude. The tubes had an incendiary device in there, and they would explode and rain fleas down on the desert floor. Then men in bunny suits would go out and collect the guinea pigs, take them back to the lab, and with tweezers pick the fleas out. And they would count how many fleas they got off of the guinea pigs. I have pictures of the flea vacuums. And then, so they did that. And in their report, they said this experiment proved we could drop fleas on a battalion-sized area. But several people on the airplane were bitten by the fleas. I'm sure the people in the bunny suits were. And only 147 of hundreds of thousands of, I think about 600,000 fleas actually made it onto the guinea pigs. So the rest hopped off into the desert.
I mean, once you accept the premise of nuclear warfare, right, that you'd be willing to, you believe you're protecting your country by having a threat to the rest of the world of annihilation, then why wouldn't you do this? I mean, it fits into the plan, right? It's like, if you think this is what you have to do to protect, there's no limits to where you will go. Except, of course, the problem is you're not protecting at all. You're actually infiltrating, and the karmic residue was instantaneous in a sense that we ended up attacking our own people. But you also hypothesize that you wonder sometimes if other governments were also involved in terms of the releases in the United States. But let's get to your story first. So you and your husband, both infected at the same time. You go to your doctor. There's immediate resistance. Why?
Well, there's just been, ever since it was discovered in 82, there's been a concerted effort to say it's not that big of a deal. The disease is cured with 2 to 4 weeks of doxycycline, a really cheap antibiotic. And this is just some sort of mass hysteria where people are saying they're still sick. We understand this disease. It can be killed with antibiotics. And even though my husband and I both got sick on the same day, a week after we went to Martha's Vineyard, which was the number 2 state for Lyme disease in the US then, 10 doctors refused to test us, or actually 8 refused to test us until we were so sick we could barely work. I couldn't work, my husband could. But
this is what year?
This is 2000. We were bitten in July of 2002, and we didn't get diagnosed till the summer of 2003.
And they were just resistant to believe.
To even test.
And they gave that you both had it, and they thought that was somehow canceling out.
They thought, well, the chief of infectious diseases in my town said, I think you guys have a psychosomatic couples thing. Psychosomatic means it's all in your head, where I was wanting attention from my husband, so I was manifesting these symptoms. And then he was manifesting the same symptoms because he cared about me. I didn't know that was a real thing, but I refused to accept that diagnosis because we had so many organ systems pretty much failing. There's no way my brain could cause that kind of massive physical meltdown. And yeah, but I had ruled out Lyme disease because none of the first 8 doctors would test it for us. Even though every doctor I said, hey, we were in this endemic area, can we get tested? No, it's a rare disease. I finally went to Stanford, and the ID doc there, infectious disease doc, said, oh, this is a really rare disease. For both of you to get it would be like winning the lottery. So
I won the lottery.
That's not the lottery.
Heck, if part of, either consciously or subconsciously, their agenda is to keep Lyme mysterious and keep the infections mysterious, then they were right to have resistance to you.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, that's the thing. As I went through this whole journey of getting diagnosed and treated and finally cured, is the deeper I got, the more I thought something is really rotten in Denmark here. I mean, something is super off. And then I can say after now 18 years in the trenches, I understand the problem, and it's complicated. I mean, so it's part of, there's a small circle of researchers who have been read in on this. Hey, it's another germ, so don't overtreat and overdiagnose Lyme disease. And there's a really ineffectual test that we've been stuck with for over 30 years, and there's been no significant improvements in it. It doesn't work in the first month, reliably in the first month of illness. So automatically a huge percentage of people are going to get chronically ill. So that's one thing, is the small circle of people who read in. They're widely published, and so they're disseminating this Lyme disease is easy to treat and easy to cure. And they have labels on after their name that say Harvard and Yale. So people believe that more. We have conferred upon these academic medical people the status of Catholic priests. Unquestionable. So that's another thing. Another thing is, this disease is really expensive to treat when it's in the late stages. And so the insurance companies, who are trying their best to make a profit, have sided with this small group of easy to treat and easy to cure doctors because it saves them money in the long run.
Is it really, though? I mean, how could it save them money in the long run if people's health deteriorates to the extent that they need constant medical care?
Well, because they don't own the patient. You have HMOs like Kaiser, which I belong to. And once I moved to that, I noticed a different shift in the attitude of the physicians there. They own you for the life of you. And if they can do prevention up front, they save a ton of money in the long term, and they track all that, versus we have like a piecemeal medical system now. And if I go to this one ID doctor who says I'm crazy, I leave him, and he saves money. And the Lyme patients are super expensive to treat because multi-system organ failure, confusing symptoms, IV antibiotics, lots of painkillers, and it's a mess.
What was the one thing that really helped you in get over the infections?
I would say my husband and I first started antibiotics, and you have to start out slow when you have a germ load that high, or otherwise you have sepsis. I mean, all the dead bugs make you really sick, and you have to detoxify. Yeah. So you start out slow with that. But so we did orals because it was really hard and expensive to get intravenous antibiotics. And so the orals worked pretty well, but every time we stopped them a month later, it would relapse. So finally, intravenous antibiotics worked. Doing like 2 antibiotics to get both forms of the Lyme bacteria. It has a spirochete long form, and it has sort of a dormant cyst form. So you have to do both to get both forms. The dormant can hide out, and traditional antibiotics don't work. So IV, I wish I would have done it earlier, because when you're doing orals, the liver, if you have a healthy liver, it filters out the antibiotics, so you can't get concentrations high enough in your head, which is what will really screw you up. The bacteria love your head.
Wow. And now you don't suffer from it at all?
No, I don't.
And your husband as well. So.
Well, he's had a couple of relapses. He didn't do IV. He just did orals. He decided not to. So it just takes relatively few organisms hiding out. Just like syphilis, they can hide out for a while. And then when your immune system is down, you got COVID, it's like Lyme's greatest hit symptoms come back.
Yeah. So you did the documentary Under the Skin, I believe it's called?
Under Our Skin, yeah.
Our Skin. And wonderful, you got attention for it and a lot of notoriety. It hit home for a lot of people. But you felt it was incomplete, that just at the end of filming that you were given some cues and some clues that there was a deeper story here.
Yeah, so we'd been filming for 3 years, and this is Andy Abrahams Wilson, the really talented director who spearheaded the project. And we hadn't been able to get any of the government officials on camera. No one from the NIH or the CDC. It just said, too hot to handle. We're not going to say anything about it. And so we thought, well, we'll go fly to Montana and interview Willy Burgdorfer, who discovered the disease, because he's retired. And we can do anything we want with a private citizen. So this was at the very end of filming after 3 years, and we were rushing like crazy to get it to Sundance, et cetera. So this was the most important interview. And so we were in Montana setting up for about 45 minutes. And all of a sudden there's this pounding on the door, bang, 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 of his house, which is a couple blocks from the BioLevel 4 lab where he worked. And it was a high-ranking person at the lab. And he says, I've been asked to sit in on this interview. And it was sort of shocking, because how did he know about it? And he's a private citizen. So the director didn't let him in. And Willy Burgdorfer was really flustered. And during the interview, he admitted things that hadn't been admitted by any government official before, which is the NIH knows Lyme disease is chronically disabling. It affects the neurological system of children worse than adults. And then after we put away the camera, he says, I didn't tell you everything. But we had to get the film out, and we had enough. No one wanted to touch the biowarfare thing. We knew we would never get funding for that. And there was no evidence to be found. It was either it was all conspiracy, or it was the hardest thing to get ever. So
did you find out who that person was who decided they fit in?
Yeah, it was Willy's understudy, Tom Schwann, and the PR person was from the labs was supposed to sit in on it, and he had to go back to Bethesda, and so he asked Tom Schwann to sit on the meeting. But it had a dampening effect on Willy, because Willy at that point got Lyme disease himself, and he was willing to talk. I mean, I think he was having remorse on the work he'd done, and he wanted people to know. So
like The Godfather Part 2, and Frank Pantangeli's going to admit, and then they bring in his brother from Sicily. He takes one look at him and he says he doesn't know what the mob is.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So anyways, that seed was planted. There's another year and a half of marketing the film and going to film festivals, and it did really well. People can watch it on Amazon Prime now if they want to, Under a Skin. And I was done with Lyme. It's just exhausting. And I thought, I'm moving on. I got a really good job as a science writer at Stanford Medical School. And then this thing happened. It's just the weirdest thing. I'm at an out-of-state family party. And I hardly know anyone in this huge party. But I sit down at the table with this really grizzly guy. And he's like the old salty sea captain in Jaws. And he's into his cups, and his wife has just left him. And so I said, oh, what did you do for a living? And he goes, I was in the CIA. I worked for the company, and doing dirty ops. And he, throughout the evening, he starts talking about all the operations he did in Vietnam. He said, basically, I did operations that sort of reminiscent of Apocalypse Now. And then at the very end, he goes, the weirdest thing I ever did was drop ticks on Cuba. And so he had no idea.
Wow.
What?
That's how you found that guy?
Yeah. So it was just like one of those things that it almost seemed like it was meant to be, because 2 weeks earlier, I had told my husband, I'm done with Lyme. I'm so tired of it. And then this dropped in my lap, and it was during the evening, I kept on asking him more and more about it. And I didn't know anything about the Cold War or that this was even possible, but I took copious notes. I'd run to the bathroom in a little piece of paper and write them down. And,
Wow.
And, that was the process of deciding, well, should I really walk away from this story? Because at that point, I had a pretty deep technical background on the disease. And I knew everybody, all the experts on both sides, because of the pretty much 4 years of research for the film. And then the nail in the coffin was a filmmaker of mine had driven to Montana to interview Willy one more time. He was pretty disabled with Parkinson's, and he sort of thought it was caused by the Lyme disease, but he couldn't prove it. And in that interview, the documentarian got Willy to admit that he thought that one of the organisms he discovered in Lyme, Connecticut, when he was doing the whole discovery thing, was a germ that they had weaponized back in the 50s, 60s. So,
Swiss agent.
What? The Swiss agent USA, yeah. So that was the point where I said, well, baby steps. I'll go to the archives, the National Archives, and see what's there and decide if I'm really going to do a film or a book on this. And I went to the National Archives, and what was weird was what wasn't in the National Archives. Here's a guy he became a made man in science for discovering this thing. And all the original photographs, this is 33 boxes of his life, basically. There was nothing no pictures of the Lyme disease discovery, inside the ticks and inside the bloods. All that data was gone. And so then the next step was, well, now I need to actually ask Willy what happened to those files. And that's when he first admitted, well, I'm not this hero that Wikipedia says. I actually was in the bioweapons program. I put plague and fleas, Venezuelan equine encephalitis in mosquitoes, and he stuffed ticks with dangerous diseases. And he was asked to figure out how to make mosquitoes and ticks breed faster so they could mass produce them for deployment.
Wow, another factor. Just amazing. Yeah, so he's in throughout the 1950s. I mean, this is his work, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was officially paid by the Public Health Service, which then became National Institutes of Health. And then he had contracts with Fort Detrick in Maryland, which was the brains of the biological weapons program. It was just massive and really, really secretive. And Detrick had commandeered all branches of the military and about 50 elite universities to do contracts, and everything, just like the nuclear project, was really compartmentalized. So most scientists really didn't know the purpose of their work, but Willy did. He spoke fluent German. After the World War II, we had brought over a lot of the German bioweapons scientists to Detrick, and he helped translate. And he said, yeah, I knew a lot of the paperclip Germans. They were really nice guys.
Well, a lot of these scientists were Nazis, right?
Right.
They came to this country, and there were like almost an NFL draft of Nazi scientists between the U.S. and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And that the ones who came here, obviously, they influenced our weapon systems.
Mm-hmm.
So take me to Plum Island, Long Island, this military base.
I don't think it's that big. It's very small.
Okay.
Yeah. You can stand on the beach at Lyme, Connecticut and see it. You can see the buildings on the island.
And so what's the association here between Plum Island and where the ticks start infecting humans?
Well, it's super close. Deer swim across the channel all the time. But Plum Island, it was originally set up, well, not originally, but after the war, Eric Traub, who was a paperclip Nazi, helped them set up an island-based biological weapons facility. And it was mostly focused on anti-animal bioweapons. So that would be part of the government's, at that time, total economic warfare. And I'm sure the Russians did it too, where you would poison, and Germany did it too. You would poison the food supply and disable the animals, and then there would be anti-personnel things. That was what Willy was working on, the anti-personnel. So Plum Island, they did have a giant tick hatchery there, but mostly the germs they researched were not what, well, I can't say that. Michael Carroll did a book on it. He didn't quite go as far as I did with the evidence, but the timelines didn't line up for me. He cited some lab accidents and hurricanes. And what I discovered is the outbreak in that area happened much earlier than what he said. It was late 60s. And late 60s was when the United States program had a huge aerosolized bacteria program and virus program. And they were spraying things from planes and boats and buoys and trucks. And so my hypothesis, it was one of those accidents where something got out. And so I traced how they thought it was a virus at first, and they couldn't prove it. And Willy came in and said, "Oh, let's blame it all on the spirochete."
In a way to, it's a red herring. It's like, this is the focus now, and we're not going to pay attention to these other things.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. So,
which I mean, some things make sense to me. This is not proof, but from the beginning, we knew that syphilis, the best drug for treating syphilis was the penicillins. But so Willy knew this because he'd studied the literature, and everybody knew penicillins work with syphilis. And Borrelia burgdorferi is very similar to syphilis. Yet when they came out with recommendations, they said doxycycline is the thing. And doxycycline works really well for rickettsias, which is what Willy was saying he thought was the bioweapon.
oh,
And it doesn't work well at all on Borrelia. And we have really ample data now to say that from animals in the lab and people, and yet the government sticks to doxycycline. And so to me, it makes sense that they were going to come out with a vaccine for Lyme disease, which they didn't think was that big deal. And they were going to treat for rickettsias really fast, and then people wouldn't die. And no one would look too deeply at what really caused it.
I see. That's so interesting. I never heard that. So they have evidence that doxycycline is not appropriate for Burgdorferi.
Yeah.
They use it anyway because the patients are getting better, but probably because it's the rickettsia, in fact.
Well, I was just listening to a lecture today, and for people treated with the 2 to 4 weeks of oral doxycycline, 10 to 20% go on to be chronically ill. And one paper says 36% go on to be chronically ill, and that's not that effective. Now, there could be other factors, but
Sure.
But the Petri dish evidence is like overwhelming that doxycycline doesn't help kill the Lyme bacteria very effectively. The penicillins do.
Wow. So the initial intention was to be able to drop them on Russia or Cuba, what have you, and knock out the animal population. But then they found that would be too expensive to feed the people after you've somehow conquered the nation, that it was smarter to actually infect people, weaken them, and then send soldiers in who were somehow inoculated to it, and that they would have an advantage. Is that true?
Yes. They had two arms in the biological weapons program. One was lethal, like really deadly. That was not very popular amongst other countries. As we found out in Korea, we were accused of dropping poisoned insects on, and there was a huge outrage across the planet for us doing that, violated the Geneva Convention. So then that's when they sort of shifted to, well, maybe we should do an incapacitating program. So that would be something like the equine encephalitises, which make you with a flu-like symptom. So it would weaken the population. It would tie up the healthcare facilities. You wouldn't kill people. So the person who ran the power plant and the factories could explain to you how to turn the knobs. And it would be a way of weakening a population before the ground troops came in or the airplane bombers came in. And you can read these documents where they explain the strategy. I have a couple excerpts in my book.
Yeah. How did you get access to all of this?
So I probably went to about 20 archives, and then there's a long history of people who published about the program, with really super, super in depth. So Seymour Hersh, Annie Jacobson, Jeffrey Lockwood, who wrote a great book called 8-Legged Soldiers about our insect-borne programs. He did not have ticks in there, though. And then the latest book, which is awesome, which really dives deep into whether we used insect-borne weapons on Korea, is Baseless by Nicholson Baker. That came out after my book, and it's really great.
So he focuses on that one incident?
Well, I decided early on, since I had so much direct historical evidence on Willy, that more interesting story is I wrote it like a fiction story, but it's all fact-based. So anytime I have quotes, it's directly from one of Willy's letters or his documents. So I wrote it more like a thriller, like The Hot Zone. What Nicholas Baker did is he said, for a year, every day, I'm going to research the biological weapons program. So he wrote it in diary form. Okay, I'm going to look into the time the US decided to put hog collar on feathers and drop it on Korea. So he would go down one tunnel, and really the objective of his book is to say how baseless the US's policy of classifying all these documents 50 years after these incidents. It's inhumane. It's like erasing history. And it's not honoring the people who've died in the process of this horrible thing we did against humanity. And we're not learning from the past, which was one of the motivations of my book, is we made these horrible mistakes and we don't want to repeat them. And yet we are, for example, releasing genetically modified mosquitoes to control Zika or whatever without proper testing and controls.
Where is this happening?
Florida. Right now.
So they genetically modify the mosquitoes to compete with the ones that carrying disease?
Well, there's this one kind of mosquito that spreads Zika, the Aedes aegypti, and they made the males sterile. And so then they thought, the females would mate with the sterile males, and then they would miss the reproduction cycle, and there would be less of these disease-carrying mosquitoes. But I heard from someone in the CDC, I haven't read the papers yet, that said the year that they did a pilot study of that in a certain area, it wasn't Florida, and when they did that, there were more mosquitoes than ever the next year. So it's just, nature is complex, the chaos theory.
And nature should come for you. There's no way about it. So, and we'll get back, but since you brought up another parallel subject, I have to ask you about COVID. So I'm a little over my head with it, but apparently there's some idea that this could come, that possibly COVID outbreak came from the Wuhan bioweapons factory in China. The people who say that it didn't are saying there's too many genetic mutations for it to all have happened at once from an outbreak. Well, is there parallel here in terms of Lyme or in terms of your research, and what is your insight on that?
Yeah, I'm writing about that now. So in my book, the central question of my book is, was the Lyme outbreak natural or unnatural? And I try to present the evidence that we have and say, this is what we know, this is what we don't know. But in part of this process, I interviewed like a real expert who the government hires all the time, and he's been involved in COVID on natural or unnatural. And he has these 8 clues as to whether it's unnatural or not. And I listed 5 in my book, and pretty much Lyme fits all of them as far as appearing to be an unnatural man-made epidemic. And same with Wuhan. And one was, there's a point source outbreak. Number 2 is that the disease itself is unusual, like high degrees of death and illness. And then in the case of Lyme disease, they said a clue is that there's multiple organisms, which means it was sort of deliberate in a way. And then, so Wuhan's the same thing. And so what we see with Wuhan, and it's been an amazing flip-flop in the attitude of the government in the last month, because they were denying in the beginning. And now the ex-head of the CDC is saying, I think it could be an escape virus from the Wuhan lab. And now Biden came out, I think 2 weeks ago, and said, we're going to seriously investigate it. So there is a general thought we need to investigate it, because it's a huge event in human history if it was a lab breach.
Well, but what about other pandemics over time, like the 18 flu? or, like you said, the bubonic plague or other things. I mean, didn't they have strange jumps and mutations and complexities that made it so difficult to treat?
Yeah, but I would say the degree to which this bat virus is different is a huge leap. And it corresponds to published papers on this bat virus gain of function. I haven't read the actual papers, but that's what the experts are saying. It's enough different, virulent, the way it latches onto your nasal cavity, that it does seem way out of line with normal mutations.
Yeah. I might even say that in my own, understanding is that one way or the other, it's probably human affected. So whether it jumped from a lab or it's environmental in the sense that and not just slow change of climate change, but actually like severe sort of leaps of toxicity that comes from human behavior in some ways, whether it's animal factories or the way we interact with nature on a whole, that's stressing the environment to such an extent that these things are even possible. So like I said, I'm not a scientist, I'm a clinician, but to me, it's like whichever direction it actually took, essentially thematically is the same thing in my eyes. It's that it's human behavior, basically reckless and pushing things to the extent where the environment has to react in some way. But so does that change if it is from a laboratory or it is from a bat? How does that change how it's treated or how it's prevented?
Well, if China were to release sort of the original research, if it was genetically manipulated, then we would know the targets, the molecular targets to look for in a vaccine. We want to attach to this spike protein that makes it more contagious. So that would help us. But China is just so secretive, that government. So we may never know. But I would say one thing, if we talk about those similarities between the Lyme outbreak and the COVID outbreak, I think anyone in the Lyme world knew that CDC wasn't doing the right thing with Lyme disease. They weren't using the newer technologies to track the spread. They were endorsing a really ineffectual screening test where in the beginning, the people at CDC stood to make, and the scientists who put their rubber stamp on it stood to make money off the patents of the vaccines and the test kits. So that was fundamentally wrong. And the way the CDC wasn't very responsive for Lyme and COVID with the evolving symptomology of it. They early on came out with, it's the cough. You got to look for the cough with the COVID thing. And people were saying, but I'm losing smell and taste, and it was a really long time before the CDC got with the program, with the latest science. Same thing with droplets versus aerosolization and masks. They were late to the game in doing that very simple test that would have saved a lot of lives.
Yeah, for sure. It's bureaucracy on one hand, and it's at worst manipulative.
Yeah, well, the CDC, I know a lot of people there, and they're really smart people and great, and they do the right things, but it's the bureaucracy, which there's just, if we saw it in the film, why not just get a good spokesperson to go on camera and explain the disease? Why, put your head in the sand in Montana and not come out or Atlanta?
And do you think essentially it's because we're afraid of being blamed? We're afraid of the United States government being held responsible for it?
For the Lyme?
Yeah.
I think the fear of lawsuits is, for both individual practitioners and the government, is a big driver right now.
Yeah, for sure. So you've been working on this, like you said, for almost 20 years now. Mm-hmm. And what do you want to tell? What is, so you wrote the book, and I'm sure you've been asked about it a lot, and you've been telling these tales and reporting the facts. But what is it that you personally want to say right now in terms of your personal experience? How are you doing it? And what is your experience like on a day-to-day basis that you feel like is something you want to tell?
Yeah, I think it's really, really discouraging how little progress the scientific medical establishment has made since this bug was discovered. We still have bad tests. A lot of people are becoming chronically ill. We're sort of ignoring the co-infections. And I just did an analysis of the last 5 years of NIH grants, and we're only spending 1% of the total budget on Lyme disease treatments. A lot of that money is going to pay for keeping labs open for basic research, and the basic research that has to be done, but we need more than 1% for the people who are sick now. It's like those people are being thrown under the bus. So I don't know. I think I get discouraged a lot of days because the whole medical industrial profit-driven machine is like turning around a carrier. It's just taking a really long time. But as long as I'm still healthy and energetic, I just feel like I want to keep fighting for the patients because I have PTSD. I just don't. It was so traumatic for our family. And when I did the film, I saw across the nation how traumatic it is to other people. In a way, I think I was a lucky one. And so I'm still standing, and I just want to fix it or make sure it's on the right track. So that's why I keep at the fight. So it's like my PTSD therapy is to keep trying to push the boulder up the hill.
Yeah. And what has been the reaction so far? I had read one Washington Post, which kind of wrote off your book, and then upon further analysis, it seems like he actually didn't even read the book.
Yeah, he didn't. So unfortunately, my book came out in the middle of the fake news epidemic across the US. So it was weird because this professor, publishes pretty much a critique of my book, and he gets it wrong in sort of the same way that the cover-up happened, where he says, no, Lyme was not a bioweapon in his op-ed and linked to my book. Well, my book doesn't say that. The book said it was something else. So anyways, there was no penalty for him lying, but it discredited my book. And I think it slowed the uptake of people reading it. So I think that was pretty frustrating, but time will tell. The facts are facts, and hopefully they'll be validated by others over time.
Yeah, for sure. And these things, unfortunately, they do take time, but I think your book has been a powerful seed in that way to get people to actually look at this from a wider lens. And that's how it worked for me. So what are you working on now?
I'm working for a foundation doing some explaining sort of science writing for Invisible International that treats invisible diseases like Lyme disease. And like my book, I hope what my book did is saying it's not just Lyme, it's all the co-infections that are spread by ticks. And you can get multiple of the co-infections in one tick bite, and they can be really deadly. So enlarge the frame. So the foundation I'm working for is trying to get more actionable evidence out there for the co-infections like Bartonella, which is cat scratch fever, is spread by cats. And then the other co-infections like babesiosis, which I had, which is a cattle parasite. And then just tackling the question, why is Lyme disease so devastating? It's been around for hundreds of years, but why is this strain so virulent, and how is it making people sick? So as a science writer, it's really interesting to try to explain it in lay terms and raise awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. And has anyone from the CDC or the military complex in some way spoken to you or commented on this in a way, or is it more like just make it go away, just treat it as invisible?
Well, I did the interesting thing of requesting Freedom of Information Act on what the NIH did when they first read my book. So that was sort of frightening. I'm glad I'd had a year to make sure everything was okay. But before the book came out, their emails to one another, because they're government employees and you can FOIA this stuff, were, oh, fake news, she just did it for the Benjis for money. It's total fiction. And then when the book came out, they read it, and the NIH, it went to the highest levels of the NIH, legal department was involved. And then they went dead silent and they never mentioned it again. So to me, that says they didn't want to give that story lift by making a big deal of it. And then shortly after this legal review happened, this professor came out with the op-ed, which was so carefully gerrymandered the truth, so carefully. And this particular professor runs a bio-level 3 lab and does biosecurity work. So he's funded by the military-industrial complex. He has studied tick-borne tularemia, which is a known select bioweapons agent. So I just question his motives.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that you would. So you can sleep well at night. I mean, you said you hit a double, but I think you hit a home run because you really, I think, and that's what I mean, because they're looking for you to make a mistake. You know, they're looking for you to extrapolate, to exaggerate, to take something out of context, to expand. And you didn't do that. You didn't have to. You just laid out things as they happened, as they occurred naturally or factually as it was revealed. And in doing that, I think you did a great service because your humility, in a sense, just kept the project very clear. And I think when you read the book, you get that sense that, okay, this is someone who's put a great amount of care and a great amount of detail into just telling it like it was or like it is. And everything else is carefully explained as hypothesis or as conjecture. So I think in that sense, it's going to last. You know, it's not going to just be pushed away. The book is going to last, and your work in general. So thank you for that. That's a great service. And hopefully the truth gets easier and easier to tell.
Well, thanks for that, because that's what I tried to do, is just be as factual as possible, because I know the whole Lyme disease topic is so contentious in every way. I mean, it's definitely the most controversial disease, and it shouldn't be if people stuck to the facts.
Well, I think the fact that that so many diseases are contentious right now is a very strange thing, that they're political in nature instead of health focused. It's crazy, but I guess that's the way the world is right now. Yeah.
But I have a lot of hope. There's some good tests coming down the pike, and there's some better treatment options being developed.
Good. I don't know, the person I had on my last podcast, Dr. Tanya Dempsey, I don't know if you've heard of her, but she has a place in Westchester, New York, and she really focuses on treating Lyme through mast cell issues.
Yeah, I think that's been a promising line of sort of treatments, I think.
Yeah.
Because the thing they're finding is the Lyme disease spirochete, when it divides, like bacteria do, there's this sort of inflammatory molecule called a peptoglycan that just makes massive inflammation over your whole body. So like suppressing that that toxin basically lets your body heal better.
So do you ever feel compassion for the ticks?
Well, that's what the first chapter was.
Yeah.
I had never really dove into why they're so good at what they do.
Yeah, you really told that well. It was so interesting. You kind of gave the story from the tick point of view, in a sense. You know, like them waiting for the carbon dioxide and to make their move. But and then the things that were done to them to make them more likely, one, to quickly regurgitate into the body and such. Pretty fierce. Not just ticks, but the other arthropods too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, lately my thinking has evolved to, we just need balance in nature. So one thing that wreaked havoc was that when we released all these non-native ticks in the New England seaboard, it upset the balance of things. Before, there was one tick that would carry one kind of bacteria, and the native population would become resistant to it. I mean, immune to it. But when we were doing this witch's brew of frankengerms, some genetically engineered, they're mixing bacteria with viruses and toxins, then everything was out of whack. And we have a lot of disease and destruction, not just humans, but the animals. And so I guess my point is on nature. Ticks are a food source for a lot of birds. and mammals too. And also maybe part of what they do is an evolutionary mutational driver, because bacteria and viruses mix inside the gut of the tick and they bite certain people. And, if you have rapid change in an environment, you want a lot of mutations so that some of the population survives. So I guess that's why I think you wouldn't want to eradicate all ticks, because they do serve some sort of valuable role in the overall scheme of things.
Yeah, I think so. You said it. I'm glad you said that there. I'll use that because it articulates in a more grounded way what I was trying to say before about pushing nature and nature's response.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very specific example. I like that. All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks a lot, Frank. All right. I'm following you now. I want to listen to your podcast.
Oh, please do.
A lot of really interesting topics, like the constellation theory is interesting, and definitely meditation's helpful.
Yeah, it's the thing that I began doing for my own health, 25 years ago. And I noticed that when I would meditate, I would feel better. And when I didn't meditate, I would feel worse. So it just became a very easy motivation tool. And it eventually it became a thing that I was searching beyond my body. But at the time, it kept me grounded into doing it, because I had that easy motivation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're all big, our favorite Utonian, I guess, is that a word? Utonian? Right now is Zach Wilson. Where for Jet fans in New York, we're all pumped about him. BYU, so excited about him. But you just got to Utah again. Had you lived there prior?
My family was originally from Salt Lake, and I have sisters and cousins here. And my parents are going to move here too.
Nice.
Yeah, so we were going to retire, and then COVID just made it super easy to move early.
True. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Kris.
Right.
I'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
But thanks for spending time with me. Is there anything else you want to share? So people can go to the website, krisnewby.com, KRIS, and the book is on Amazon and plenty of other booksellers. Is there anything else you want to share about your experience and how you're doing right now?
No, I'm just plugging along. I continue on with the investigation. There's a documentary that will probably be coming out. So I'm trying to work with them to add to the story.
They're interviewing you?
Yeah.
Great.
It's just, it's more of a history of the bioweapons program, and the content of BITTEN will be included.
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. It's really valuable, and I'm really proud to have to spend this time with you.
Well, thanks so much.
Please be in touch anytime.
Okay. All right.
Thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Hunting for Healers podcast. Kris Newby was amazing. We need to push for more answers from government. We need to understand diseases like Lyme, where they actually come from. What's the United States government's responsibility in this? Because if we're wondering why people aren't trusting science these days, it's for reasons like this. I'd love to see what you think of this episode and more. Special thanks to Barrett Martin for his perfect music. This is Frank Vogt. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Please subscribe, write a comment back. Let me know what you think. And if you have a medical story that you think is worth telling, I would love to hear about it. You can contact me directly through the link. Thanks so much. Have a beautiful day.